everyone. Welcome to a new Getting to Know Japan webinar. Thank you for joining us. I'm Jeffrey Mazziata, the Activities Coordinator here at YCAPS. I'm stepping in today for our usual host and program director of the series, Amani Kidd, who's behind the scenes today. Amani, we look forward to having you back as moderator soon. Today, we're joined by Dr. James D.J. Brown, who will be presenting on Cracking the Crab, Russian Espionage Against Japan, from Peter the Great to Richard Sorge. A little bit about Professor Brown. So Dr. James D.J. Brown, PhD, is a professor of political science at Temple University, Japan campus, of course. His research centers on Russia-Japan relations. So Dr. Brown regularly writes op-eds, including for Nikkei Asia, the Japan Times, and The Diplomat. He also writes in Russian and Japanese, including for the Carnegie Moscow Center and Nikkei Business. He's frequently quoted in the media, including by the New York Times, the Financial Times, The Economist, the Wall Street Journal, Yomiuri Shimbun, Hokkaido Shimbun, even the BBC. We're very grateful to have him today, a very notable expert on Japan-Russia relations. It's great that he could be here to talk about his book that he published earlier this year. One final thing I'd like to mention, just a kind reminder to everyone, please refrain from turning on your microphones during the duration of today's recording and presentation. That being said, we'll get started with today's presentation, and I will turn things over to Professor Brown.
It's a real pleasure to be involved in another YCAPS event. I think it's a great organization, and I think this is perhaps, I don't know, my third or so opportunity to speak with the group. So thank you very much. Actually speaking to you from the UK at the moment. So I'm just over here for a couple of weeks, and I'm usually based in Tokyo. So let's get straight into it. I'm going to share some slides with you all. And as Jeff has mentioned, I'm going to be speaking today about my book. Here's the hard copy of it, which came out earlier this year on the topic of Russian espionage against Japan. Okay, so I'm mindful that this is the Getting to Know Japan series. There are people who will no doubt know Japan very well, others much newer to the country. So whilst I'll begin by talking about the specifics of the book, I'm very much open within the Q&A to speak about broader things to do with Japan-Russia relations, which I follow very closely, but also to do with broader issues to do with spying. And in particular, in Japan, that's a big topic at the moment because many of you might have seen that the new administration of Takaichi Sanae, one of their priorities is to introduce an anti-spy law. So if there's interest in that, we can address that in the Q&A. But first of all, I'll speak for about 30 minutes introducing the book. Okay, so first of all, the objectives of this book. My previous book was about the territorial dispute between Japan and Russia. And after that, I was looking around for another topic, really to look into in a great deal of detail. And there were a few false starts. I initially had this idea of focusing on an institutional history of Japan's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Maybe I'll come back to that at some point. But then I decided I really wanted to do something that would appeal not only to an academic audience, but also to a broader audience as well. And it struck me that whilst there's a lot of material on Russian espionage in general, there's not really so much about Russian or Soviet espionage against Japan. So there's one exception to that. Some of you will know the remarkable story of Richard Sorge, who's pictured in the bottom right of the slide there. There's an excellent book by Owen Matthews, which came out a few years ago called An Impeccable Spy, which looks at the Sorge case in a lot of detail. But, there's a lot more to the history of Russian and Soviet espionage against Japan than just that one story. So my aim in the book is to explain some of the other really interesting spy stories towards Japan And here I'm interpreting espionage as not just being stealing secrets, but also influence operations, the so-called active measures of the Soviet Union towards Japan as well. So the book contains an awful lot about espionage, but the goal is slightly broader than that as well. It's to tell the story of Russia-Japan relations through that lens of spying. So that I hope that readers of the book will come away, yes, knowing a lot about spying, but also understanding the broader history of this relationship between Russia and Japan. Because a lot of the books on that relationship will focus on the territorial dispute. It's very important. I've written a book about it myself, but this is perhaps a different way of understanding the centuries of relations between these two great powers. And then lastly, as well, I wanted to write a book that, as mentioned, was not exclusively academic. So I've tried to write it in a more sort of entertaining style to include amusing bits where I found that it's been relevant. And as I say, to appeal not just to a scholarly audience, but to a wider audience as well. So a little example of that is that there's one moment that I found somewhat amusing, which is when members of a Soviet reconnaissance unit, this was related to the Nomonhan conflict in 1939, put on sheepskin coats and infiltrated a flock of sheep in order to try and get close to the Japanese lines. So little things like that I've included as well, both relevant and also quite interesting. A note about the other picture on here. We'll come back to this individual in a moment, but that's Izumi Kozo, who in some ways is a spy of importance comparable to Sorge and has received very little attention, especially in the English language scholarship. So more about him a little bit later on. Okay, so to start off telling you about this book, I just explain the sort of breadth of it first of all. So what I wanted to do, as mentioned, is to tell the full story of the relationship through this lens of espionage. So that means starting right at the beginning to start with the first interactions between these two great powers, going back to the 18th century. And starting off with this period where there is no formal relations between the two sides, and really the Russian Empire is trying to learn as much as possible about Japan. So we start off with the first Russian spy, as I'm calling him, in Japan in 1771. And then also look at the role, the way in which the Russians used castaways, Japanese who were, perhaps traveling from one location to another by sea around Japan, swept out into the ocean by a storm and ended up finding themselves being washed up on a Russian coastline. And the Russians made very active use of these individuals to try and learn as much as possible about Japan. So the second chapter focuses on that. We then move on to the 19th century and look at the role of stealing secrets in Russia's opening of relations with Japan, which was finally achieved in the mid 19th century. And it's from that point that we really start to have the two sides being more like equals, and the Russian side seeking to really compete with Japan over influence on the Korean Peninsula and also in Manchuria as well. And a bit more about one of those stories in just a moment. We then move on to the start of the 20th century. Russo-Japanese War features prominently there. And in my view, the that's one moment where we really see a failure in Russian intelligence towards Japan, and that was a significant contributing factor towards Russia's loss in that conflict, with the Japanese clearly having the upper hand when it came to intelligence in that conflict at the beginning of the 20th century. In chapter 6, we then move on to the Soviet Union's creation. and the efforts to promote communism within Japan, including the Soviet Union's efforts to assist with the creation of Japan's Communist Party. And then in the 1930s, we have Soviet intelligence at the Nomonhan conflict that, as mentioned, was 1939, where you have the Soviet Union giving Japan very much a bloody nose in that conflict, a decisive victory with significant implications for the subsequent years. So that was chapter 7. In chapter 8, that is the bit which is well being covered in some other works, but nonetheless, I thought it was important to include the Richard Sorge story and his main Japanese assistant, who is Ozaki. And then also in chapter 9, we look at some of the other spies who are active in Japan at precisely the same time during the late 1930s, early 1940s, and the impact that they had on Soviet intelligence and very much Soviet understanding of what Japan's intentions were during the Second World War. And I finish off the book with a rather provocative conclusion outlining a sort of textbook example of how to spy on Japan, learning from the successes of the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union. Clearly, that's not my idea of encouraging espionage against Japan. Rather, the thought being that if you have a better understanding of how to succeed in spying on Japan, well, that helps you to understand what the best way to defend the country against that espionage. Okay, so that's the broad overview of what's covered. Quick note about the individual who's pictured there. He's another remarkable figure who features in the book. That's Vasily Ashchepkov. He was a Soviet spy in Japan and was a particularly effective one because he spent some of his early life within Japan. He was sent by the Russian Empire to Japan as a very young man to study at the seminary within Tokyo. So to study to be a Russian Orthodox priest. And as a result of that time spent within Japan from an early age, he had excellent Japanese and went on to be quite an effective spy for the Soviets. Ultimately didn't turn out well for him because during the period of Stalinist paranoia, he was accused of being a Japanese agent and was arrested and died in prison in 1937. So that shows that often for many of these figures that I touch upon in the book, those who spied for the Soviets, often it didn't end very well for them. The other remarkable thing about him is that he played a major role in martial arts, including being one of the founders of this Russian martial art called Sambo, which has a lot in common with judo. So just goes to show that many of these spies who I look at in the book are interesting for other reasons as well. Okay, so don't worry, I'm not going to go through the book in enormous detail, chapter by chapter. Instead, in this relatively short session that we have together, I'm just going to pick out three particular moments that I think are of special interest. And then, in the Q&A, if you're interested in other parts of the book, I can certainly develop upon those. But the first one that I wanted to talk about in a little bit more detail is going back to this period in the late 19th century, where Japan has opened up to the world, has modernized, industrialized, and pretty rapidly has become a real competitor with the Russian Empire. And this competition is playing out in large part on the Korean Peninsula. The Russian Empire is interested in pushing south, in bringing Korea under Russian influence, not least in order to get the use of Korean ports. And Japan is very interested in controlling the Korean Peninsula, not least for security reasons, so that they could deny that area to other powers, because if another power were to control Korea, that could be a vulnerability for Japan. So what we have in the late 1890s is that Japan's put itself in a strong position. You have Queen Min. At this time, Korea has a royal family, and Queen Min is seen by the Japanese, at least, as a more pro-Russian figure, someone who's opposed to Japanese influence. So there's a conspiracy, and it is arranged that Japanese forces, Japanese groups, they murder the Korean queen. And after her removal, you have the king, who's seen as a much sort of weaker, impressionable figure who is put heavily under Japanese influence. He's described as a prisoner in his own palace, and as a result, Japan is able to encourage him to appoint a very pro-Japanese cabinet. So for the Russians, this is obviously a setback. They're competing for Japan for influence. The Japanese have succeeded in getting the upper hand. So what do the Russians do? Well, in particular, you have the chargé d'affaires in Korea at the time, Alexei Speer, and he decides to make a plan to free the Korean king from Japanese influence. So they make these arrangements to disguise King Gojong as a woman, to dress him up in women's clothing, and early one morning to sneak him out of the palace and smuggle him to the Russian legation, to the Russian embassy, essentially. And then once there, under the protection of Russian forces, he is encouraged to dismiss the pro-Japanese cabinet, and some members of that cabinet are then arrested and executed, and then to bring in an alternative government that is much more friendly to the Russian side. So you can see here an example of how espionage is well beyond just stealing secrets and does involve some sort of intrigue, kind of sneaky activities in order to serve the Russian national interests. So this was seen as enormously successful by the Russian side. It was temporary, however, because after the outbreak of the Russo-Japanese War in 1904 and Japan's subsequent victory, you have Korea, of course, falling very firmly under Japan's control. So it was a temporary victory for the Russians here. Okay, so that's the first case I wanted to mention. The next one is moving forward to the 1920s into the 1930s. And this is another case of intrigue rather than the stealing of secrets. It's the Tanaka Memorial. So this is a document that was supposedly written by Japanese official Prime Minister Tanaka Giichi in 1927. And it's been described subsequently by some as being Japan's Mein Kampf, as a supposed document setting out Japan's plans for domination. And it includes the line, to conquer China, Japan must first conquer Manchuria, Mongolia. To conquer the world, Japan must first conquer China. So this subsequently came to be seen as proof of Japan's aggressive intentions, its ambitions to achieve first regional dominance and then global hegemony. And the document is a complete fake. It was not written by Tanaka. It seems not to have been written by any Japanese whatsoever. There's some doubt as to exactly who was behind it, but this is a piece of disinformation designed precisely to make Japan look like an aggressor. Now, it's not clear whether the Soviets actually were behind its creation. It's possible that it was actually Chinese nationalists that produced it, but what is clear is the Soviets made particularly active use of it. It was acquired by Felix Dzerzhinsky, Iron Felix, who was the head of the Soviet intelligence service. And he was kind of delighted about getting this document. According to Trotsky, who wrote about it, when Dzerzhinsky got this, he stated ecstatically that this document in and of itself could provoke international upheavals, events of vast importance, war between Japan and the United States. So what the Soviets did, having got hold of this, is they wanted to publicize it to ensure, especially in the United States, that people knew about it in order to foster mistrust, suspicion of Japan within the United States, and as you see within the Trotsky quotation, in order to hopefully provoke conflict between Japan and the US. So, what did the Soviets do? They translated this document into several languages, including English, and they arranged for it to be distributed widely within the United States, precisely in order to encourage anti-Japanese feeling. Now, this document has been exposed by reputable scholars as absolutely a fake, a forgery, no doubt whatsoever. But what's very interesting is that the Russians have never admitted that, never accepted it, to the extent that history textbooks used in Russia to this day by Russian school children continue to insist that the Tanaka Memorial was genuine and really was proof of Japan's aggressive intentions. So they're kind of clinging on to that claim. Okay, so that was the second one I wanted to talk about. And then the third, and I think possibly the most interesting, is about the spy who I mentioned at the beginning, Izumi Kozo, whose Soviet code name was Nero. So I find it most remarkable that there's so little about this individual, despite the fact that the information that he provided to the Soviets was seen by Stalin as being exceptionally important. So there's only this one photo that I've at least been able to find of Izumi Kozo. There he is pictured there with the bald head and circled in red. He was a Japanese diplomat posted to Moscow shortly after official relations were established between the Soviet Union and Japan. So he arrives there in 1925. And the Soviets arrange for him to be lodged with a Russian landlady. And whether it was the Soviet intention or not is not entirely clear. But soon enough, he falls in love with the landlady's daughter, Elena Pirskaya, and he marries her in 1927. A few years later, a son is born to the two of them. Okay, so you have this Japanese diplomat working in Russia, married to a Russian woman. And whether it was always the intention of the Soviets or not is not clear, but soon enough they recognized the opportunity to use the wife in order to get Izumi to spy for the Japanese. So they place pressure on his wife, Elena. They do so in a pretty kind of unpleasant way. They arrest her mother, her sister and brother are executed, and they place this pressure on her and get her to spy on her husband. So that's how it begins. First of all, she's spying on Izumi, and then she recruits him. And he begins to pass on information to the Soviet side. And his greatest contribution to Soviet intelligence against Japan comes in the form of code books. He provides code books and various coded telegrams to the Soviets. And with these examples and with the regular updates that he provides them, he enables the Soviets to make good progress in cracking Japan's diplomatic codes. So that means that the Soviets are not reliant on, in a sense, sort of second-hand information which is passed on from the Japanese. They're actually able to read what is being communicated from Tokyo to the various embassies in Europe. Okay, so this was a big contribution to Soviet intelligence towards Japan during the war. It meant that they were able to read a large amount of Japan's diplomatic communications. And this was especially important because Japan, through its close relationship with Germany, was therefore receiving a lot of information from the German side. So, in fact, through reading these diplomatic communications from Japan, it meant that the Soviets were able to get a lot of information about Germany as well. And an indication of the significant importance of this to the Soviets comes from the fact that their Japan specialist within their intelligence service, known at the time as the NKVD, was the most decorated Soviet cryptanalyst of the war. That was Sergei Tolstoy. It's also known that Stalin had a preference for SIGINT, signals intelligence, over human intelligence. The reason for this is, well, famously, Stalin didn't trust people. He was very paranoid. Richard Sorge, who we know was actually providing really excellent information about Germany from Tokyo, Stalin didn't really trust the information he was providing, notoriously describing Sorge as a shit who set himself up with some small factories and brothels in Japan. By contrast, because signals intelligence was coming directly from the enemy side, that meant that he trusted it much more. It wasn't being filtered through some other individuals, so he placed greater store by it. And through these diplomatic communications that they were able to crack, it gave the Soviets lots of information, including on a Japan-German plot to assassinate Stalin in 1939. It provided warnings of the coming Nazi invasion, albeit that Moscow, Stalin ignored these. And also, it provided reassurance that Japan would not attack the Soviet Union in 1941. Many of you might know that after Nazi Germany attacked the Soviet Union, Moscow was deeply concerned that Japan would also attack in the Far East. And it was crucial for them to know Japan's intentions and therefore to decide to what extent they could move units from the Far East in order to defend the capital. Okay, so I'm mindful of the time. So what I'm going to do is just quickly finish off telling you about Izumi Kozo and then move on to a conclusion. So the note here is just to highlight that right up until this day, the Russian side continues to emphasize the importance of the information that they received through cracking Japanese cipher telegrams. This is from the Russian state media earlier this year. With the anniversary of the end of the war, they had a lot of articles in the state media, and here they highlight all of these telegrams that they had received, I believe, because of Izumi Kozo's assistance. So what happened to this important Soviet spy, Izumi Kozo? Well, he was never detected by the Japanese side. Sorge was. He was arrested and executed, whereas Izumi kind of finished the war, returned to Japan in 1946, and was never at that stage detected or arrested. He had lost touch with his wife and son at that point, and so in 1948 he gets in touch with the Soviet embassy seeking information about their whereabouts, and he's re-recruited in the post-war environment. He's no longer a Japanese diplomat, so he doesn't have access to the same level of information, but he's still able to pass on what information he does have. And he has about 40 meetings with his new Soviet handler and is paid quite a significant sum per month. And it was only in the 1950s that his status as a Soviet spy was exposed when one of the Soviet intelligence officers, Yuri Rastvorov, defected to the United States from Tokyo in 1954. Izumi was then questioned by Japanese police on a couple of occasions, but was never prosecuted because he died in 1954. Okay, so why is it that we don't know more about this figure who potentially had a big impact on the conflict, on the Soviet Union's war? Well, in part because it doesn't really make a very good story for the Soviet or subsequently the Russian side. By contrast, Richard Sorge was someone who spied for the Soviets for ideological reasons. He was passionate about communism. And he's also a sort of more appealing figure. There's lots of stories about his drinking, motorbikes, various girlfriends. So they've really made a propaganda success out of him. By contrast, Izumi Kozo, he was manipulated into spying for the Soviets through the disreputable means of placing pressure on his family. So that's why for Moscow, they're much happier to keep quiet about this figure. But I think that he deserves as much attention as the much more famous Richard Sorge. Right, okay, so I've sort of rushed through few of the main points there. So just to bring it to a close, before I turn to your questions, I want to highlight that this particular book only goes up to 1945, but there will be a second volume. I'm in the process of writing it at the moment. The working title is Spy Paradise, Russian Espionage Against Japan from Cold War Conspiracies to Cyber Espionage. And so that takes the story from 1945 right through to the present day. And it includes, attempts to influence Japanese politics and cyber attacks as well. So if you're interested in aspects of that, I'm very happy to talk about that in the Q&A. So I think that's my initial time up. So I'll move on to Q&A. And as mentioned, very happy to take questions not only about the book itself, but more broadly about questions of espionage or contemporary Japan-Russia relations. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for this wonderful presentation, albeit I know it's a little bit faster than you would normally have, and so I thank you for keeping it brief for us. And wish we could get more in depth, but of course, I would encourage. We did share the link to the book in the chat earlier. We'll share it again if you'd like to get into more depth beyond what we can cover, even in the Q&A. I would definitely encourage everybody to pick up the book and check it out, where I'm sure you'll get tons of great information. But one thing I wanted to ask about, we had a few questions in the chat. I was curious about the Tanaka Memorial. Um, we had a question from Bobby Na, who asked, what was Japan's response to the Tanaka Memorial at the time? Did they not vehemently deny its legitimacy? And then also, I was curious, I was planning on asking, I know that you had mentioned, obviously, scholars tend to look at it and say it's clear that it's not real, not legitimate. But I was curious at the time, how successful was it? How did the U.S. Take it? Did it actually affect policies being taken and such like that?
Yeah, thank you very much. So, um, it's a pretty bad forgery, actually, that there has never been discovered an original Japanese version of it. So, I mean, that makes it pretty unconvincing as a Japanese document, but it was very influential and did shape opinion precisely because many people wanted to believe it. They already had quite negative views of Japan. I'm thinking particularly in the United States at the time. And so, as is the human temptation, it's to look around for information that confirms your existing view. And so, for that reason, people said, yes, look, I've always believed that Japan is an aggressive power, and here's the proof in the Tanaka Memorial. So, I think there was that desire to believe it. So the Soviets pressed for its translation, its propagation, and it was very much picked up on not only within US politics, but within popular culture as well. There were various magazines that published articles about it. It was featured in a prominent sort of anti-Japanese propaganda film at the time of the Second World War as well. So it was a big success of disinformation from the Soviets. Although, as I say, they probably didn't create it, they certainly made good use of it.
Very interesting. And then, so that definitely talks about its effectiveness in Russia's usage of it. What about Japan's response at the time, and how strongly did they push back against this, and was anyone listening, so to speak?
Yes, yes. Um, I think that in terms of what we would see today as sort of government communication skills, the ability to reach out to a foreign audience and kind of affect their perceptions. At the time, I think most governments were not so adept in doing it as they are today, and certainly the Japanese government wasn't. So I don't think that there was a concerted effort to persuade the US public that it was a forgery. And perhaps also, had they tried, because they were pushing against existing prejudice, that they might not have been successful.
Mm, that's a good point. Yeah, really, it's enlightening. Really, one of these things that the point that you mentioned of whether people thought it was real or not didn't matter so much because it was a convenient narrative. It almost was, it's what people wanted to hear on the US side anyway. So it ends up being effective. It's very thoughtful to think about it that way. Um, I'm going to continue with more of the audience questions. We've got a great question from Soren Dixon, who also we know from Temple University, Japan. And I was also curious about this. So Soren asks, I know this is the focus of your next book. So maybe I should have left this for later, but I'm going in time order to encourage early question asking. But what did Russian spying in Japan look like after World War II? How much was Japan reliant on the US for counterintelligence? Perhaps you can give us a brief preview and teaser. Something that I'm curious is the phrasing of Japan as a spy's paradise, which also I think comes into that time frame.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you very much. Hello, Søren. Yeah, it's quite a broad question. It's the whole focus of the next book. I mean, the Soviets. Well, maybe the way to approach it is through the title, Spy Paradise. So. Um, During the period of Japanese militarism, Japan was a pretty hard target in some ways, that it was a police state. There were very restrictive rules. Um, After Japan's democratization, those rules against spying were eliminated. And of course, that's a good thing. You want kind of authoritarian kind of laws to be removed. But in a way, they perhaps went almost too far. So it remains to this day that there's no law against espionage in Japan, and for that reason, Soviet spies in particular have had a pretty good time of it within Japan. So right from the 1950s through to the present day, it has been happy hunting ground for Soviet and subsequently Russian spies. Now, someone also asked about counterintelligence. There, no, not so much assistance from the United States. Rather, Japan has been seeking to do it largely itself. That responsibility falls primarily on the Japanese police, with the Tokyo Metropolitan Police playing a big role. But the counterintelligence efforts are very fragmented. So you don't really have a fair match. You have very well funded and professional Russian spies on one side, and Japanese police officers who are not experts in Russia trying their best to counter these espionage efforts.
Very interesting. We've got a few interesting like some that are quite in the weeds on some of the stuff that I'll save for a little bit more, but I'm gonna hit some of these broader questions. We had a great question by Garen Malloy, who's also been a YCAP speaker for us on the Community Conversations series. Garen says, "Great book, James," fellow Hearst author himself, and he'd like to ask between the two books. How would you explain the incredible degree to which Japanese proved willing to pass information to Soviet Russian agents, despite not being ideologically aligned or seeing themselves as traitors?
Thank you very much. So there's there's a bit of a divide here that up until 1945 there were quite a few ideological spies that the Soviets had some success in recruiting Japanese socialists. After 1945, that just goes as a motivation. So it becomes instead primarily money and compromise. So money is always an effective means of recruiting people, especially if you find someone who's in financial difficulties and is therefore more vulnerable. But I think the compromise element's been particularly important as well, with Japanese individuals who have perhaps found themselves being manipulated. They have done something of which they are embarrassed. At a certain point, maybe they still could have backed out, gone to the authorities, admitted what they'd done, but they were too ashamed to do so. So instead of backing out at that point, they've been pressured into getting even more involved. There's also, I think, quite an effective way in which the Russians have used the sense of obligation and duty within Japanese culture. So, wining and dining Japanese contacts, giving them presents, beginning with kind of small gifts that no one would really turn down, and then gradually building it up. And in doing that, building a sense of obligation within the Japanese agent, with them feeling, well, I've been taken for all of these fancy meals, been given these presents. I need to give something back in return. And that's also been quite an effective way of getting the assistance of Japanese agents.
Interesting. You did mention the monetary rewards or the gifts and things like that as being quite a big motivator. During your talk, you talked about Izumi and the post-war period and from 48 to 52 and him getting around 30,000 yen pension. Well, I'm curious, can you give us a rough idea? Was that quite a regular payment amount that active spies would be getting as well per month? Or did it run the gamut of all sorts of ranges depending on who it was? And then could you roughly give us like 30,000 pension at that time? Can you give us a what that might mean like in today's money so we have a better understanding?
Yeah, well, I can't make the calculation off the top of my head, but in short, it was a very significant amount of money, especially because he's returned to a ruined Japan. He doesn't have his job with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs anymore. He has to move in with his sister because he doesn't have anywhere else to live. So he's basically broke. And so that support from the Soviet side well, he saw it as essential. More broadly, the Soviets and the Russians subsequently have been, pretty well generous in their payments. Not immediately. They deliberately begin quite small because they know that if you straight away provide some huge amount of money, you might scare the person off.
Mm.
So there have been cases where initially they give, just a very small amount, like a sort of or a handkerchief, or there was one case where a sort of prepaid card for use on the motorway or something like that, and then gradually building up from there.
Interesting. Yeah, that kind of the carrot, keeping that carrot on on the leash in front of him. It's very fascinating. I think that's a very interesting thing to me because I remember when I was in the army, or even when I was getting my secret clearance, they always talk about like, willingness to take bribes and anything like that. And in my image, I'm always thinking of these big like someone offering lots of money, but it isn't always the case like that. It tends to be those little bits, hey? Very interesting. So if I can entertain myself and also Jenna asked a question, if we can get back into one of the more entertaining stories, tidbits that you mentioned. Jenna Lingdecki Heavenrich asked, could you go into more details about the sheep story? What was the context of that? What did it accomplish?
Yeah, so regrettably, I don't think it accomplished that much. I think it's an indication of just sometimes the creativity that was shown by the Soviet side. So this, no doubt, was something where just a local relatively low level individual decided to do this. So it wasn't systematic, and I don't think it was particularly successful. But there were other instances of more creative activity that perhaps did have a bigger impact. So at Nomonhan, the Soviets wanted to trick the Japanese into thinking that they were just going to act in a very defensive way. And so they engaged in this activity that was described as sort of white magic, all sorts of activities to try and disguise what their behavior was, including having loudspeakers that would play the sound of sort of tanks and kind of heavy kind of machinery moving in order to confuse the Japanese side. And so, yeah, there was quite a lot of creativity from the Soviets at that time.
Interesting. This is because at that time, of course, they didn't have the modern technology to really see troop movements as well as we can these days, I imagine. So actually,
Yeah.
that sounds very interesting. The creative concept. That does lead to another question I wanted to get to, is that Alexandra Cummings, she mentioned, in the book coming up, potentially you have covering more modern technologies. But Alexandra was curious if there were any interesting stories, and I think you kind of just mentioned one regarding earlier technologies that were being used, or maybe interesting linguistic or cultural interactions that you thought were striking.
Mm, mm. Well, I think that I mean there's quite a few things to pick up on there, but if I may concentrate on particularly the linguistic one, that's the area where I think we're seeing the biggest change, and it's something which I'm very interested in at the moment. Despite the success that the Soviets, the Russians have had, it has always been somewhat difficult to spy on Japan because of the language barrier.
Mm.
And so it has meant that, for some Soviet intelligence officers here, it's been a real struggle. And that's remained true up until very, very recently. It's only really with, the dawn of ChatGPT 2022 that protection of the language barrier has been removed. So I think the fear is that the opportunities for Russia to engage in more disinformation, more interference in Japan are quite considerable because you can now produce natural sounding Japanese at basically zero cost.
Interesting. Yeah, that's so. I guess it's a definite challenge for Japan. You did mention earlier before we got started. You mentioned Takaichi's potential anti-spying laws. Is this because of the potential ease of being able to access this? Is this why Japan should be looking at these now, or what are your thoughts on that? Or if you could tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, it's been a long-term concern of many within the LDP that Japan is a spy paradise. This is an idea that came to the fore in the 1980s. There were a few prominent cases, in particular, a Soviet intelligence officer, KGB officer Stanislav Levchenko, defected from Tokyo to the United States in 1979 and revealed this remarkable picture of the extent of Soviet espionage within Japan, which extended to, he alleged, a cabinet minister being a Soviet agent. That in particular is Ishida Hirohide. And so that led to many within the LDP saying we need to do something. So in the mid 1980s, the Nakasone administration wanted to introduce an anti-spy law. They failed. There was too much of a public backlash, people saying this is going back to the bad old days of Japan being a police state. But after that, there have always been some within the LDP who have wanted to introduce an anti-spy law. It was something that I'm sure Abe would have liked to introduce. He was able to go some way with the introduction of the Designated Secrets Act. But Takaichi, as a protege of Abe, wants to go that step further and actually introduce an anti-spy law. So it's not specifically to do with those recent developments to do with language. It's a long-standing desire.
Interesting. Oh, we did have some discussion in the chat I want to mention. So when we were discussing costs and the compensation, so someone pulled up potentially that the average annual income in Japan may have been around 100,000 yen, around 1950. So it sounds like the 30,000 yen a month was a significant pension if those numbers are accurate, which is quite interesting. Um, I've got some very basic. Maybe I might go. Maybe this would have been nice to come in as the first question, but this came in a little bit in the middle of our talk, and I do understand the reason you chose it, but I would like to ask you. So Tom Whitson has a very simple and basic question. He gets the new book title, but he's asking, why cracking the crab? Why did you choose this title? And we didn't really
Yeah,
get into it, so.
yeah, thank you very much. So I was somewhat in kind of two minds about it because in some ways it's a bit odd. People might think, well, what on earth is it to do with a crab? But the reason why I went with it is because it's actually a quote from Richard Sorge. He said that spying on Japan is like cracking a crab, in the sense that initially it's a hard target. It's got this kind of tough external shell. That's partly, the language difficulty, sometimes institutions being closed off to outsiders. But once you get through that hard external layer, it's easy pickings. It's soft inside because there aren't the same controls on information sharing that might be found elsewhere. So, being from Richard Sorge, that's why I went for it.
And so essentially both of the titles are coming from meaningful quotes, essentially. Meaningful phrasing. That's very cool. We had a couple questions I want to ask. I mean, we touched a bit upon it when we talked about the memorial, the Tanaka Memorial, and its effectiveness. But we did have a question from John Mensing about so looking at not the Japanese side, but maybe the Russian side to America. We had a question from John asking about Soviet efforts to get Americans involved in a war with Japan, potentially in the 30s and early 40s. We also had a question from Kawamura-san. I think this was in conversation with John's question, talking about America being quite isolationist at the time and potentially Russia could have agitated anti-Japanese sentiments in the US by stressing their expansionism in the Pacific instead of China. And was asking, why did Kremlin manipulate Tanaka's imperialist intention in China instead of the Pacific Ocean? So a bit, if you could talk a little bit more about, or potentially some Russian attempts in the US.
Hmm. Hmm, hmm, hmm. Yeah, thanks very much. So, there is a big section to do with Soviet activities within the United States, not just about the Tanaka Memorial, but subsequent to that as well. And in particular, seeing the United States, which itself was seen as something of a spy paradise, as being a good location in order to spy not only on the US itself, but in order to spy on third countries. Because it was seen as relatively easy to spy on the US at the time. The US had good intelligence on other countries, including Japan, and that way you were able to pick up a lot of information as well as to influence US policy. And there, of course, the big factor was ideology, where you had a lot of officials, 1930s, 1940s, who were pretty sympathetic to socialism and therefore were vulnerable to being recruited by the Soviets.
Very good. We are running low on time. If I can bring things back to today in the and modern day in the future. So where are we at today? What are our major concerns of espionage from Russia currently in Japan? Are there any major cases of note that were discovered recently? Things that might be something to think about.
Yeah, absolutely. So, how I see it going is that there'll essentially be more of the same when it comes to recruiting officials. So, it'll be the same old thing. Russian diplomats in inverted commas, actually intelligence officers, attending events, looking for people of interest, exchanging business cards, inviting them out for drinks, dinner, and then beginning that process of trying to charm and recruit them. That will continue. And that will be targeted against Japanese officials, politicians, journalists, SDF members, and others. But there will also be these newer activities. And I think the upper house election was particularly interesting in perhaps the Russians dipping their toe a little bit in the possibility to influence elections here, where you had Sputnik Japan, the Japanese language version of Russian state media, having an interview with a candidate from Sanseito just before the election. You also had a lot of mysterious activity on social media where accounts that were promoting pro-Russian narratives, very divisive narratives, were given a huge boost. So it seems like perhaps Russian bots were involved in that. I think we might see more of that sort of activity. And there's another thing which I'm very worried about. Some of you might know about this concept of yamibaito, which is like dark part-time work, where criminals within Japan have recruited people online to do kind of basic criminal activity for them. You pay some kind of student or something, small amount of money, and they're not really aware of what they're getting involved in. There is the danger that Russian espionage could use that mechanism in order to carry out disruptive activities. We've seen it in Europe, where people have been employed online, not realizing they're working for the Russians, to carry out vandalism, arson, sabotage, precisely designed to stoke social discord. I'm quite concerned that that could spread to Japan.
That is very interesting. I wasn't aware of that. I'm assuming it's Russia that's been bribing my neighbor to keep banging at all noises at all times of the night. So
Almost
now that I
certainly,
know
Jeff.
that, certainly
Yeah.
must have been. But that's also very interesting. So in the online space, I know we've really recently there was like with the Twitter and the people I guess there was a new implemented feature where you could see where accounts were based, and I saw some news by like you have a lot of like MAGA accounts that ended up being based outside of the US, and it kind of exposed that a bit. And of course, I think we had already realized a lot that there's a lot of Russian influence on American elections in these type of methods. But I'm surprised to hear that it's also happening in Japanese in Japan because of the language barrier. But I guess the ChatGPT is good enough that they're even finding success in that in Japan, you say.
Yes, absolutely.
Wow, that's very interesting. Um, very fascinating. I think it's a great place to potentially end today with the thought of the future and what's happening these days. Again, I would like to encourage everyone. I have a few small things. I want to share the link for Professor Brown's book again into the chat. So I definitely highly encourage folks. This is a link for the Japan Amazon page, which would be the easiest source of getting the book in Japan. However, for our viewers that are outside of Japan, obviously there's Amazon.com. There's also the publishers page. So if you look and you see the publishers page, that might be another great access point for finding Professor Brown's book. I would highly recommend it. And we have a time frame on the upcoming book. How long are we? How deep into it are you?
Yeah, I'm writing the conclusion at the moment, so I'm well through it, but I haven't signed a contract with a publisher yet. So part of their willingness to publish the second one will be on how many people buy the first one. So
So you heard it,
if you
guys.
are considering buying it, then doing so might contribute to the publication of the second, which would be rather nice.
Yep. So if you found today's talk interesting, give the book a buy, and then we will luck out and we can learn about the rest of the story of the modern day from Professor Brown, who I also want to mention Patricia in the chat, who I strongly agree with. And she just wanted to compliment you and said you're wonderfully articulate in your very murky field. So thank you for that very easy to follow, very in-depth talk today. I'm going to pass it over to Amani. I think she had a small message she wanted to mention to everyone if I can add a spotlight in and just pass her the mic for a second before we get into upcoming events. But again, I want to say thank you, Professor Brown, for this wonderful, wonderful talk today.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Brown, for your time today. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, as usual, for our monthly session of Getting to Know Japan. I just quickly wanted to say happy holidays to everyone, Merry Christmas, and a Happy New Year. This is our last Getting to Know Japan session of the year. So I just wanted to say thank you to everyone. A huge thank you to Jeff. Thank you so much for taking over the moderating duties this year. As many of you know, I welcomed a baby at the very, very end of last year. So this entire year, I've been kind of in mommy mode, but Jeff has been kind enough to moderate and also ask a lot of really amazing questions to all of our speakers this year. So I'm very appreciative. Thank you so much, Jeff. And thank you also to Isaac Nordenberg, who also stepped in many times behind the scenes to help when I wasn't able to help behind the scenes. But I also want to thank all of our audience members. Thank you so much for your continuous support for Getting to Know Japan. I truly, truly appreciate it. Although I wasn't able to moderate a lot this year, I did coordinate all of the sessions. And so it makes me happy to see a lot of you constantly returning each month for each session and giving us a lot of great feedback that really makes me super duper happy. And I'm sure everyone here at YCAPS truly appreciates it. So without much else to say in closing. I just wanted to say thank you. I wish you all a happy holidays, a safe holidays. I hope to see you all next year. Hopefully, I'll be able to return and moderate. And so thank you, everyone, and happy holidays.
Yep. So we'll look forward to Amani having a nice BBC moment of a child running in behind her as she moderates No Japan. Everybody for staying patient with all our talk at the post seminar talk. Thank you for Professor Brown sticking around as well. And again, I want to mirror Amani's holiday greetings. So everybody have a safe holiday, have an enjoyable holiday, spend it with your friends and family, and we look forward to seeing you in the new year. All right, guys. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
FadTech's IT support and mobile internet service helps make events like this one possible. Thank you.